Hello, everyone. How's everybody doing? TJ here with Dead History. Hope you enjoyed our fun little intro there. Of course, yes, it is our seventh president's birthday today, Mr. Andrew Jackson. So I have a very special guest with me tonight. I'm actually really excited about this because I don't know, maybe a couple months back, I was actually speaking to Kurt Dion and of Kurt'sHistoricSites.com, and Kurt said, "Have you listened to Plodding Through the Presidents, the podcast yet?" I said, "No, I don't think I have." He said, "You need to go do it." And boy, was he right. So today I have with us Mr. Howard Dorre of Plodding Through the Presidents. Howard, welcome. Thank you so very much for being here, sir.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm really excited.
Yes, and like I was just saying, so they have a wonderful podcast, Howard and his wife, Jess. They do this just awesome, fun stuff. And it's really unique because, and Howard, I'm going to let you explain it a little better here in a second, but it's just these obscure, fun, unique stories about the presidents and founding fathers and all these different historical people, things that you don't really usually hear too much of. And that is why I find it so fascinating. So, Howard, why don't you touch on a little bit about specifically what the podcast is about and how it came about? What gave you this idea to start this podcast?
Yeah, sure. So back in 2013, I decided that I wanted to know more about American history and fill in all the gaps, figure out how we got where we are today. So I decided I was going to read a biography of every U.S. president in order. And about 9 or 10 presidents in, I realized I really was kind of in love with the founding era, with those early presidents up through the 1840s or so, especially like John Adams, John Quincy Adams. I started a blog when I started this reading project, and it just started to focus more and more on lesser known stories about these figures, like digging into things that may only be mentioned in a couple of sentences or a paragraph in a biography. And then in 2020, I kind of turned it into a podcast with my wife, Jess, where I'm bringing in lesser known stories that maybe are myths that we're looking at debunking, or stories that are really kind of untold about the presidents or their families or other founders. And Jess doesn't know what I'm going to talk about. So I'm bringing stories to her. She's reacting in real time. She really brings the humanity to the show. So you're left with the rest of that here.
And it's very true. And you guys, you and Jess do a fabulous job. And it's a unique combination because, like you said, Howard, Jess has no idea what these stories are going to be. So it's, she's basically right there just getting the full reaction of what her reaction is to these unique stories. So it's a lot of fun. And you guys do a wonderful job, truly and sincerely. So,
well, thank you.
When I first, so everyone knows, when I first decided, I have to interview and bring Howard on to discuss a few of these fun stories. We started to discuss, when can we make this happen schedule wise? And we said, well, maybe March. And then Howard said, well, March 15th is Andrew Jackson's birthday. And have you touched on ever or covered his wild, crazy funeral? And of course, I do my presidential series on YouTube, and now I'm doing my vice presidential series. So I've covered Jackson, but I've never really gotten into the specifics of his crazy funeral. And we're going to do that here in a few minutes. And the interesting thing is, when I listened to the episode of Howard's podcast regarding this funeral, I was driving to work. I listen to it a lot of times when I'm driving to work because I have, quite a drive into work. And I couldn't stop laughing because Jess's reaction to some of this and Howard, telling the facts of what he obviously uncovered during his research, it's really quite comical and interesting. So, Howard, I'm going to let you have the floor. Why don't you tell us, set it up here. Andrew Jackson, he apparently had a very mischievous pet parrot, did he not?
Yes, absolutely. And as I kind of relate this to you, I'm going to try to match your enthusiasm, but I don't know if that's possible. I'm going to do my best, though. Yeah. So, I mean, Jackson, going a little bit back before his funeral, his actual death, it was a long time coming. in two ways. In one way, his health was just horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, he had probably congestive heart failure, possibly tuberculosis. At least one bullet left in his body of two that had been lodged there, slowly leaking lead and causing him pain forever. He was laid up a lot of his time in the White House. Everybody expected him to die. So that's one way that his death was a long time coming. And in the other way, in sort of a karmic Final Destination type way, he had cheated death so many times that it was eventually his time. So after all of these things, after a duel in which he was shot in the chest, and nobody knew it because he had such a big coat on. That was his plan. I'll wear a big coat so they don't know where my heart is.
Nobody knows, yeah.
Right? They got pretty close to his heart, this guy,
Yeah.
Charles Dickinson.
Yep.
But Jackson stood there like nothing happened, his foot or his shoe filling up with blood. And then when it came his turn to shoot, he got the guy in the abdomen, and that guy died later that day.
Yep.
But Jackson went on to live, basically running on fumes or vengeance throughout his life until he was 78 years old. That's when he finally succumbed to time and everything else there at the Hermitage. Everybody expected it to happen. He had said things like, I'm racing toward death as fast as I can. He was ready. He was ready to see his Rachel.
Yeah, of course.
And he was there in a chair in his bedroom, and everybody was sure he was dead. One report says that a doctor even declared him dead. They moved his body to the bed, and then boom, he was alive. One eyewitness said that he went on to give a 30-minute sermon about religion, which, I mean, for someone who's about to die, you gotta wonder how, the final words of a lot of famous people, I'm always very skeptical about, because you want to preserve their legacy. You want to present them in the best light. So you're going to say that they said something very profound, when in fact sometimes you get the truth. Like John Adams, there's a story that he said Jefferson survives.
Yeah, lives. Yes.
There's another story that says his last words were actually "help me," which is not as compelling, but
not
probably
as poetic. Yes.
no, but probably more honest.
Yes, of course.
So Jackson's last words were reportedly saying that he couldn't wait to see everyone there in heaven, his whole family, both white and black. Those were reportedly his last words, which make him sound really great.
Yeah, of course.
We don't know if those were his last words. And if there's anyone who could make "I'll see you in heaven" sound even half as threatening as "I'll see you in hell," it was Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson, of course, yes.
So 78 years old, laid to rest at the Hermitage, and his funeral was attended by many, many people from the area, around the Hermitage, around Nashville. I'm like losing my geography there.
Yeah. It's in the Nashville area. Yep.
Yeah. Just hordes of people were outside of the Hermitage as the Reverend was giving the eulogy on the porch. It was an outdoor funeral. You couldn't fit all these people inside. It was a very solemn event. People were there to pay their respects. It was not a joyous occasion. People wearing black.
Of course.
But before the funeral really got started, one thing you don't expect at a funeral or in general is to hear just a long string of loud obscenities and profanity coming from the porch.
Yeah, of course.
And that was Andrew Jackson's pet parrot, Paul. Now, when I first heard this story, again, I'm very skeptical by nature. It sounded like the kind of thing that your enemies might make up.
Yeah, of course. It got stretched over time into this big exaggeration. Yes. Definitely.
So I was very interested in the truth behind it. So first I started researching this bird, Paul, to find out, did it even have a parrot? What was its name? What was the history?
Yeah.
And he bought this bird. Some people say it's an African gray parrot. We don't know for sure. Yeah. But he bought it for his wife, Rachel. And by all accounts, she loved this bird. So when she died in 1828, in between his election to the presidency and his inauguration. It said that she was buried in the dress she bought for his inauguration. Jackson, of course, was heartbroken. He went to the White House. He left this bird behind, but he never stopped thinking about Paul. He wrote to his adopted son, who was taking care of the bird. He said, tell me, how is old Paul? I need to know, is she okay? 6 months or so went by, and then he got a letter back from the Hermitage that didn't mention Paul at all. No mention of the bird. And Jackson was just going insane here. He wrote back, he's like, I need to know, tell me whether this bird lives. And Paul did live.
This seemed to be the most pressing issue on Andrew Jackson's mind, was this bird.
Yes.
For quite a long time, it seems.
Yeah, definitely. It seemed like he didn't really trust anyone to take care of the bird among his family. And he talked about how this bird was really the only thing left that he had of Rachel. So he kind of associated it with her, and he wanted to make sure that he reunited with the bird. He really loved this bird, even though he didn't take it to the White House, which, maybe is good, based on how the bird talked. But we know that the bird survived, or, maybe it died and they replaced it before Jackson knew. But the bird, Paul, was described as saucy. And that's key, because that makes everything make sense a little bit more for me. The only primary source that we have for this story that Jackson's parrot was, squawking out obscenities at his funeral and actually had to be removed was someone who was 15 years old at the time.
Okay.
And this boy was in college back then because, I don't know, people lived to 16. You went to college at 14. I don't know.
Yeah, of course, it's true.
And he and some of his buddies just a few weeks before had visited Jackson there and, wanted to hear stories from the great old hickory. And he described Jackson as kind of, withered and quiet and, curious about their futures.
Yeah.
Very legit. Everything that he said made sense. It sounded like this true account of a 15-year-old boy's disappointment that this old war hero wasn't telling them dueling stories.
Yeah.
And then just a few weeks after that visit, Jackson died, and this boy was among those at the funeral. And he later wrote, or he shared the story with a reporter or a writer about this bird and the obscenities and Paul having to be removed. But the gap between that funeral and that being printed was 70 years.
Wow.
So it wasn't until this man was something like 90 that we have this story. And by that time, he had lived a lifetime of being this revered, respected reverend. He was really a pillar of the community.
Okay.
That's what makes me think that the story is probably true.
Okay.
For one, he was 15 when he saw this happen, and that's the kind of thing that would be imprinted in a 15-year-old boy's mind.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And I don't think he would necessarily have a reason to lie, because he was a fan of Jackson's. He really liked the guy. He wouldn't be saying something like this to make him look bad. And it wasn't to make him look bad.
Now, so he lived to be, quite old himself, and you said 70 years later. So we're talking like 1905, 1910, somewhere in that range when this story was first made public. Is that correct?
Yeah. It was a long time. And at that point, it kind of took off years after that when, somebody noticed it in the newspaper. It started being printed in trivia books and repeated. And it kind of got a little bit bigger to the point where now when it's told, the source is the actual reverend at the funeral who said it, which isn't true.
Which is not true.
And it kind of makes it sound like it took place in a room where the bird had to be like pulled out of the room.
Gotcha.
When in fact it was outside.
So now, in all your research of this really interesting story, was there any other accounts of this? I know you described the bird as saucy. So was there other accounts where people wrote in letters or any sort of correspondence where like they ever heard the bird cursing before this funeral ever took place, or anything like that you came upon in all your research, or not really?
Nothing like that. We know that the bird's caretaking responsibilities seem to drift from person to person based on Jackson's letters. And I don't know why that is. It's either because Jackson didn't trust anybody to take care of the bird and thought, this person wasn't doing a good job, let's give it to this person.
Yeah.
Or maybe the bird was very difficult to take care of.
Yeah. Okay.
And
I remember in your episode of the podcast when you were discussing this fun story, I guess there were some accounts where this bird seemed to like feet or toes of people, correct? That it would go after?
That's actually a different presidential bird.
That's a different bird. Okay, it's a different bird I have it confused with.
Dolly Madison's macaw was a toe nabber.
Yes.
And there's accounts of the children who would visit them just basically screaming in terror as the bird would chase their toes. And there's one account that at one point this macaw bit James Madison's finger to the bone.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty severe.
I don't think it was swearing at the time, but still, that's pretty scary.
Yeah. So obviously Jackson's bird, Paul, he was there at the funeral of Jackson, so he outlived Jackson, or maybe it's Paul II, maybe a replacement, who knows? But is there any accounts, like, was there anything ever written where finally the bird, they just like let the bird go? Did the bird die, or you couldn't find anything?
No, it seems to disappear after Jackson died. Not the bird itself, but any references to the bird.
Huh.
So I don't know that the family thought the bird was that important to write about it. I'm sure that they would have made sure Paul was taken care of because it was so important to Jackson. But we don't have any records of really what happened. Yeah.
So interesting. So, I mean, one would have to assume that if we're going to believe this story, that, of course, they say, especially African gray parrots, they mimic. So I guess it was Andrew Jackson that was constantly swearing that probably taught this bird all this profanity. Is that fair to say?
That's what makes the story so great, is because it sounds like, of course this parrot would be swearing because Andrew Jackson, cussed up a storm, and it just makes sense that a parrot would have picked that up and repeated it at his funeral. And that's possible.
Yeah.
But some things we know about birds swearing, parrots like this pick up on intense feeling and things that might be said in the heat of the moment. If there's a lot of feeling and passion behind them, especially if they're hard words, maybe the end in a kuh sound, I don't know.
Yeah.
So birds pick that up. So you don't have to teach a bird to swear intentionally necessarily.
Yeah.
But if you say some words, the bird picks them up, and then you react positively to those because it's kind of funny. That's going to teach the bird to keep saying those things.
That's pretty cool.
That seems most likely to me.
Yeah, that's a great story. I love it. I absolutely love it. So now, another one of the stories that I really, really enjoyed was Gouverneur Morris. So those of you that don't know who Gouverneur Morris is, he was a pretty important founding father. As everyone knows, it was, of course, Madison who's the father of the Constitution. But it seems that Morris was basically the penman of the Constitution, so to speak. He was also a declaration signer, if I'm not mistaken, correct? Or was it just the Constitution that he signed?
I think it was just the Constitution. I believe he was too young for the Declaration.
He was too young for the Declaration. So now the really interesting thing about Gouverneur Morris, so I went to visit his grave in the Bronx in New York because I've tried to go see all Declaration signers, Constitution signers, all that kind of thing. And it's very interesting because after listening to your episode about Gouverneur Morris, I didn't realize that he's buried where, the church is now. It was probably not too far in proximity to where his actual home was in the Bronx, somewhere in the vicinity. And this, to me, is one of the most, I actually bought your t-shirt. I went on your shop and I bought the Gouverneur Morris t-shirt. It's supposed to be here on Thursday, so I'm really excited about that.
Nice.
But yeah, so why don't you tell us a little bit, because this is a guy, for anybody that has never heard of Gouverneur Morris. Obviously, like we just said, signed the Constitution, penman of the Constitution. But this man has one of the most interesting life stories that you will ever hear. I mean, I'm talking like a wild life. This is somebody who was, just to give you guys, the audience, a little hint, we're talking a promiscuous fellow who liked to basically have sexual relations in public places throughout the world. He did all sorts of very, very interesting things, even as far as having an infection, basically, that he ended up killing himself because he infected himself even further because he tried to perform self-surgery regarding his private parts. Let's just put it that way. So trust me, this story is wild and crazy. So please, Howard, if you could tell us a bit about Gouverneur Morris, his interesting life, and even his interesting wife a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So Gouverneur Morris, and how you pronounce his name is, it's just a fun game to play because just go at it with all your might. You might be right.
I thought it was Gouverneur. That's how I always pronounced it before I heard your podcast.
I don't know if I said Gouverneur in the podcast, but that's what I feel in my heart it is now.
Gouverneur, yeah, okay.
Yeah. It's spelled a little differently than governor.
Yeah.
And his name, when I first learned that it was his first name, kind of annoyed me because I felt lied to. I thought he was a governor or something. Yeah, and I haven't felt that way since I learned about Judge Reinhold.
Well, exactly. It's very funny you say that because when I was first doing this whole crazy, like, let me go visit all these graves all over the world, or country, I should say, I first, saw his name and I was like, Gouverneur Morris, was he governor of New York? I was like, wait a minute. And then I realized, I was like, wait, that's dude's first name. Like, what is that all about? So interesting. I felt the same way. So continue on.
He's criminally underrated in American history, I think.
Yeah.
He was just kind of an aristocratic New York-born prodigy. He was part of the Continental Congress. One of his first assignments was to go out to Valley Forge and see what was going on and write a report about it. And that just makes me think of, the beginning of Silence of the Lambs, where Clarice is tasked with going to talk to Hannibal Lecter.
Going to talk to Hannibal, yeah.
Not that Washington was a cannibal, but just as far as being famous and big in stature and intimidating,
of course,
pretty similar. But Gouverneur Morris and George Washington really hit it off.
Mm-hmm.
And Morris ended up, helping the army a lot by working with Congress to get them what they needed to an extent. He was pretty pivotal in the congressional side of the war. And he's really most famous for his role at the Constitutional Convention. Like you mentioned, he's the penman of the Constitution. He took the first drafts and he wrapped it up neatly and he consolidated the amendments. And most of all, he wrote the preamble. He is the one who put the words "we the people" there, which not everybody liked. No. There was a lot of debate about that because you're saying this is not a compact of the states. This isn't states together. This is the people of the United States who were making this Constitution. Yeah. And people still argue about that today.
Yeah. Yes. Now, also one other thing, not to interrupt you, Howard, but one other thing that I know Howard's going to get to that I kind of left out in prefacing this whole story is this was also a man who had a few very severe injuries and situations throughout his life. Basically, we just went from Andrew Jackson, who may have been cursing like a pirate with a parrot on his shoulder like a pirate, to a man who, in Gouverneur Morris, who had a peg leg like a pirate. So continue on.
There's one more Jackson connection that's even a more awkward segue we'll get to.
Oh, awesome. I love it. Okay, continue on.
So the Constitution, we the people. Then he went off to France. He was there for his friend Robert Morris, no relation, to kind of work on some financial stuff and, sleep with a lot of married women in public places like the Louvre.
The Louvre.
Which I guess was apartments back then. It wasn't really a museum, so it's not like he's there in front of the Mona Lisa. But also in carriages. And his diary from the time is just a treasure trove of euphemisms that I highly recommend reading more about. While he's over there, while he's behaving badly, George Washington tells him, hey, you're the new minister to France. You better shape up, because I need a man. No, you better just get in shape. And so Gouverneur Morris is suddenly um, trying to help during the French Revolution. He's seeing heads on pikes go by him. He wrote a new constitution for France that
Yeah.
unfortunately never got adopted.
Mhm.
He wrote to the king saying, hey, maybe if you give people food, things will get better. I don't know if that letter got delivered, but he had good intentions. He helped a lot of the sort of aristocrats escape instead of, be guillotined. He really, a lot going on over there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then he comes back to the US and he becomes a senator. And one of the reasons that he's not more universally known, like a household name, is
Mhm.
because he wasn't really celebrated by the folks that wrote history for a while. You've got
Mhm.
the Democratic Republican Virginia dynasty of Jefferson, Madison, Monroe.
Of
They're
course.
not going to write about him because he's a Federalist.
Mhm.
And at one point, he was ready to say, you know what, the U.S., this experiment didn't work out. I'm ready to let New England basically secede. He was
Mm.
in favor of the Hartford Convention.
Of course. Yeah.
And, that doesn't endear him. But to get to his sort of his leg and the accidents throughout his life, he had kind of a relaxed, what I call a relaxed confidence. He just kind of went through life. He did what he wanted. And I think that may have extended to his body in some ways because things just sort of happened to him that seem, I don't know if they're clumsy or just accidents. When he was young, just a young teenager, I think, or maybe 12 or 13,
Mhm.
he, I think, accidentally knocked over a pot of water, boiling water, and his arm was just so severely burned that they thought he was going to die.
Wow.
And later, someone who saw it said that it looked like it had been withered to the bone.
That's unreal. Oof. Gruesome.
Yeah. Yeah. So he had one deformed arm. His leg he lost in what we think was a carriage accident. There are lots of stories about what really happened. Some
Mhm.
say he was, jumping out of a window of a married woman. But he was probably, in a carriage coming from a married woman's house. And something with the wheel, and his leg was badly injured. It was removed. Then his doctor comes back. I don't know where he was, and he says, "Oh, you know what? I think I could have saved that leg."
Oh, thanks, Doc.
Yeah, too late.
Yeah, yeah. And this carriage accident or incident, am I wrong in something I read said it was in Philadelphia somewhere
Yeah, I
possibly?
believe so. Yeah,
Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
yeah.
Continue.
So he had a peg leg, but he didn't let that stop him from dancing, from seducing women, from just being this force of nature.
Mm, it's interesting.
Yeah.
So now he's got a peg leg.
Yep.
Now this is all. Now is this prior to his going to France? Like so in France, while he's minister to
Yeah.
France, he has the peg leg and he's
Yeah.
got the deformed burnt arm. He's got all these deformities, and so then he's in France. Washington tells him basically to shape up, and then he eventually makes his way back home to the United States. Correct?
Yes. Yeah. While in France, he's got the arm is injured, the leg, but he's got this je ne sais quoi that just transcends any physical limitation he might have.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he's got a brilliant mind.
Yeah.
And those things combined really led him to live a life of mostly getting what he wanted.
Yeah.
And a lot of his friends were saying, hey, you got to settle down. You're getting older. You should get married. And he kept putting it off. And then eventually, when he came back to the United States, as he was getting older, he hired this woman as a maid, Anne Carey Randolph, who had a really kind of a checkered past and a scandal that she overcame that we talk about in the podcast episode.
Mm-hmm.
Really tragic. Um, she was involved with three brothers, and two of them died, I believe. She at one point had a child that did not survive, but it was covered up in a way in which um, a man was accused of murder, and she was implicated as well.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, she was born into this aristocratic Virginia family, the Randolphs,
Mm-hmm.
and basically sort of expelled from society.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, she moved out east, up north and eventually came to live with Gouverneur Morris. They fell in love, and at a New Year's party, he surprised all his guests by proposing to his maid.
And so, I mean, he basically, Gouverneur Morris and his wife, she basically, you know, like you said, had a child who didn't survive. And the man who was accused of possibly murdering that child was actually her brother-in-law, if I remember correctly, isn't that?
Yeah, so the child wasn't, this is all long before she met Gouverneur Morris.
Of course. But, you know, this is what the scandal is of her life. And, you know, she then comes to makes her way to New York, and Gouverneur Morris hires her as housekeeper and everything, falls in love. And basically, even, and I'm sure you're going to touch on it, he basically ignores anything that anyone's saying about this woman. I mean, anything negative that anyone's saying, he doesn't care, and he loves her, and that's that.
Yeah, he did a bit of a background check. He wrote to John Marshall, who is, you know, the Supreme Court Chief Justice.
Chief Justice, yeah.
He was involved in the trial in which, you know, Anne Randolph was involved, and her brother-in-law. And Gouverneur Morris was saying, hey, you know, there are rumors. What do you know? And I believe that John Marshall basically said that she couldn't be clearly implicated in anything. And that was enough for Morris. He knew this woman. He didn't care about her reputation. He didn't care about all the rules of society. He never really did.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he basically defended her, especially when John Randolph of Roanoke, the other brother, came after her later in life and was determined to smear her and ruin her. And that guy, just, I think of him just as this pipsqueak of Congress. Yeah.
Yes.
But Gouverneur Morris defended her, and they had just a lovely marriage and a beautiful baby son, and they were a happy family.
And obviously, Gouverneur died before her, but they're both buried right there in the Bronx. Actually, yeah, I had visited there, like I said, not too long ago, and that's actually the picture here. That's Gouverneur Morris's gravesite there. For those of you that are looking at the screen, so yeah, so that's right outside the St. Anne's Church there in the Bronx. And from what I obviously have read and know, of course, Anne is buried there with him. So it's pretty interesting. When I heard this podcast and heard all these wonderful, or some of them not so wonderful stories of Gouverneur Morris, it was very interesting to me because I had seen that, you know, that gravesite year and a half, 2 years ago, and then I hear these crazy stories, and I'm like, wow, I wish I would have dove into Gouverneur Morris earlier. Like, it's just so fascinating. And it's true what Howard said. To anybody out there, I'm sure a lot of you watching this or who are going to watch this have no idea who this man is. Maybe you've heard the name, but I really highly recommend you kind of looking into him because he's an interesting character, to say the least.
Yeah.
So, was there anything else on Gouverneur Morris that you said there was a Jackson tie too here?
There's one little thing we could probably mention. Now, I always thought of him as kind of a do-it-yourself kind of guy. You know,
oh yeah,
he's not going to let anything stop him. He's going to do what he wants. He's going to take care of things his own way, which most of the time works out well. When he was 64 years old, he had a serious blockage in his urethra. It was very painful. And it's not like you could just go to the urgent care or, you know, have a doctor on call. Sometimes these things took time. And this wasn't the first time it had happened to him. He had successfully on his own cleared up a previous blockage with a thin piece of, and here's the Andrew Jackson reference, old hickory. Hickory wood. He had used that to clear his blockage. So he thought, I can do this. I know what I'm doing. But this time he didn't use hickory.
Oof. What did he use, Howard?
He used a piece of whalebone, most likely from his wife's corset. It did not go well.
At all. It really didn't go well.
He sustained injuries during this botched self-surgery that went on to kill him.
Oof.
Yeah.
And from, if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, from your podcast episode, not only did he sustain injuries that obviously killed him with infection and everything else, but pretty much mangled his downstairs region during this process of trying to perform this self-surgery. Is that correct?
I can't necessarily speak to that, and we may have speculated in the episode, but I can't back up that what it looked like. We don't have pictures or reports
Well, of
of what
course,
that
but
nether region looked
it
like.
obviously became severely infected. The infection obviously ended up killing him, like you said.
And like I said earlier, I love to dig into primary sources.
Of course.
I'm very skeptical by nature. This absolutely sounds like a story that someone's enemies would make up after they died and spread around. So I needed to find the primary source on this, and it came from a good friend of his writing to another friend, explicitly just laying it all out. He said, let's see if I can find it here. Having unskillfully forced a piece of whalebone through the canal so lacerated the parts as to create a very high degree of inflammation, which has been followed by a mortification that I am told will prove fatal.
Oh, and that was, I believe the friend was a Rufus King?
Yes.
Remember correctly? Yes. Another New York guy. So there you go. All right. So there actually is a question for you from one of the audience here. It's actually from Kurt. His question to you, Howard, is: have you and your family had an opportunity to visit any historic sites related to founders or early presidents, such as the Hermitage or the Adams Park and their tomb in Quincy, Massachusetts?
My domestic bucket list consists of the Adams National Historical Park and the Stone Library, which is my happy place that I go to that I've never actually been. So no, I've not been able to visit that. I've not been to the Hermitage. I've spoken to folks from there. We have been to Mount Vernon, Jess and I both. We enjoyed the
picture in the intro is you guys at Mount Vernon. Very nice. Yep.
Yeah, and I've been to, I guess what you could call John Quincy Adams's place of death in where he suffered his fatal stroke in the old House chamber.
In the old House chamber,
Congress.
Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah, it's so when I did, when I drove all around and doing all this stuff in 2020 during the height of the pandemic, the good and bad that I had from it was I had all these sites and graves to myself. Literally, there was no one else. However, a lot of these museums or homes and that sort of thing were closed to the public. So I wasn't able to go in. But I've been to the Hermitage now twice. It's fabulous and wonderful.
Yeah, you almost hopped an electric fence, right, to get to that gravesite?
So, yeah, it was interestingly enough. Yeah, the first time I ever went to the Hermitage was, I believe it was like June maybe of 2020. I, was just taking this trip. I wasn't really researching if something was open. I was taking a shot. Long story short, the Hermitage was closed due to, Corona at that time and everything going on. And I pulled up to the front, like little entrance. It's kind of like a dirt road down to get to the main Hermitage house and visitor center, so to speak. And a security guard pulled up in a car.
Oh, wow.
And he was very nice. He was just like, yeah, it's closed. Maybe open in a couple months. And I actually I tried to bribe the security guard. I offered him about $50 or so to be like, hey, can you maybe just let me go see the gravesite? And he said, no, he couldn't. Well, I then tried to play detective and try to figure things out. Like, I looked on Google Maps and an view of everything. And I noticed that the back of the Hermitage property backed up basically to a little piece of woods that was right near like a CVS pharmacy or something to that effect. So I parked in that parking lot of the pharmacy. I walked across the road, went through the woods, and there's actually trails back there that it looked like many people probably frequent. But it leads right to the back of the property of the Hermitage, and there is a very small little electric fence. Now, I'll be honest with you, I don't even think the electric fence was actually working. It didn't seem to be. Sometimes you can hear a buzz from an electric fence. There was nothing. And it wasn't tall. I could have very easily hopped over it. And I could see probably about 100 yards, about a football field away from me, I could see his tomb, the back side of it. So, of course, I started thinking these devious plans of like, I'll hop the fence and I'll run up and take the pictures and run back. But then I realized, like, it's a pretty far distance. I had already seen the security guard. I didn't want to cause any trouble, of course. I'm just looking to see the grave. But there was also, it is still kind of a working farm in parts of it. So there was cows and stuff out to pasture. So I would have had to like run by bulls and all this stuff. I probably would have been like stampeded. I just decided against it. But yes, I did almost hop the fence at the Hermitage. That is a true story.
Yeah, that would be an embarrassing way to die, or just article about being arrested.
Yeah, imagine, it's like, believe me, I've kind of hopped fences to see graves before doing this kind of fun, adventurous stuff, but it wouldn't make for a good story, especially when I'm from New Jersey. I'm in Tennessee, and I have to call somebody. Hey, can you bail me out? I'm in jail for trespassing on Andrew Jackson's property. So it would have been interesting. But
although, I mean, if you believe that the spirit of Andrew Jackson roams there, I don't think he'd mind, because he himself didn't have much of a problem trespassing and encroaching in other areas.
It's very true. Yeah, he didn't seem to have too much of a problem with that. So
no.
Now another quick question for you. Two quick questions, actually. Another two. Sure. Who's your favorite president, Howard?
My favorite president, not necessarily who I would consider the best president, because these 4 years were some of the worst of his life, but I'm most fascinated and connect most with John Quincy Adams. I think that his story is just very fascinating. I love that he kept a journal from the time he was like 11 up through the end of his life. So you can see him kind of evolve from this like snotty Holden Caulfield character up to this cantankerous Larry David character. And his observations, all the things that he lived through, it's just it's like a sequel to the American Revolution. It's his life. And I think that his fight in Congress after the presidency, because he was president, and then Jackson won, defeating Adams, but then Adams went to the House of Representatives. Massachusetts said, no, we're sending you back to DC. And for something like 17, 18 years, John Quincy Adams was a very vocal opponent of slavery.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of ways, his fight, you could argue, was more noble than the fight of his fathers against, taxation and the revolution. So I'm very fascinated by John Quincy Adams. And the more I read of his diary, the more, I don't know if connection is the right word, but the more kind of enamored I am with learning more about him.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I know there's several historians who I've even personally spoke to that say that, there's probably a lot of proof that John Quincy Adams was even more brilliant and intelligent than his father was. So, I mean, he was a very brilliant man. It's interesting. You don't hear too many people give you a JQA answer when you ask for favorite president. It's funny because my favorite is Thomas Jefferson, the TJ thing. Plus, we both share an April 13th birthday. So I always found that kind of fascinating. But it was, people hear me say Thomas Jefferson, they're like, do you know what kind of person he was? And I'm like, I am very well aware of what a not so pleasant person he was, especially when, dealing with slavery and the issue of enslaved people. Obviously horrible things, but, I try to look at some of the actual good things that Jefferson did and what a brilliant person he was. But yeah, so people try to sometimes give me a little bit of a crooked eye when I tell them Jefferson. So it's interesting. So last but not least, Howard, before I let you go, and I don't want to take too much time, I just want everyone to please, if you listen to podcasts, go listen to Plodding Through the Presidents. It's absolutely incredible. It's awesome. How many seasons are you into right now, Howard? What season are you guys up to?
Yeah, right now we have 3 bingeable seasons out. We do short bursts of a season that are up to 12 or 13 episodes long. Then we take several months off to kind of recover and live our lives as normal people before jumping back in. Yeah. So season 4 will be our next season, coming a little later this year.
Nice. Good. I look forward to it. And it's everybody should go start listening if you haven't already listened to this podcast, because these couple stories that we talked about today, Jackson's parrot and, Gouverneur Morris and all these crazy things, I mean, that's not even scratching the surface. There's There's killer rams that Thomas Jefferson owned. There's all sorts of crazy, wild stories. And Howard and his wife Jess do a wonderful job narrating through these stories and telling us these unique things in history. So, Howard, with that being said, I think you told me is it your son's birthday today?
Yes, it's my son and Andrew Jackson were both born today.
Well, there you go. Happy birthday to your son.
Thank you.
I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so you can go celebrate with your son on his birthday, of course. But I really appreciate you doing this. Hopefully down the road we can do it again because it was a lot of fun. I love these crazy stories. I'm just looking to make sure I didn't miss any questions. It looks like I got them all. But again, Howard, thank you so much, guys. Plodding Through the Presidents. Go listen. You'll love it. You'll really, really enjoy it. I promise, because I do. And again, Howard, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Thanks. Talk to you soon.